Hi, welcome to the May 4th meeting of the Kubernetes VMware User Group. On the agenda today, there wasn't much unless somebody just added something to the agenda notes doc. I do have a few announcements of updates to the CSI plugin and the vSphere cloud provider, but I don't think those will take more than a few minutes. And as usual, if we don't have enough agenda, anybody here is welcome to do late nominations verbally on things they want to talk about, discuss, or just share interesting observations with others. Before we get into this, I think before I hit record, somebody was mentioning that they believe the Google groups are being end of life. I don't really know. I do know that within the Kubernetes SIGs, working groups, etc., they've had an aspirational goal to move to something other than Google groups for years, literally, but nothing's ever happened. One of the issues that makes the Google groups attractive is that the Kubernetes project, like many other open source projects, shares documents by using the Google Docs platform. And Google Docs conveniently allows you to give permissions to membership lists for Google groups. So if you were to move to something that maintained membership lists kind of out of the Google universe, I think that you might be signing up for quite a bit of work, because you might have to do something like maintain a list of emails and apply permissions to those individually. And even when you get into these things like lists of emails, parts of the world like the EU and California have strict privacy standards on those. And personally, as a group maintainer, I would really not like to go there. I'd rather kick that off on someone else, where you have things that potentially could go on, like filing forms to be forgotten and things like that. So I'm not really sure. I haven't been informed that in the near term any plans are underway, but it could be. I shared the agenda notes document. If anybody doesn't have it, speak up and I'll post it again in the chat. If you join late, the chat rolls off and you don't get an opportunity to see it again. But what I have in there is I cut and pasted updates to the CSI plugin. There was an update to CSI just in the last week that fixed a bug related to sync caused by deleting a persistent volume claim. And it says that they've resolved a panic observed in the syncer container during the sync process. So those sound like pretty significant bugs that got fixed a week ago. There was also about a month ago a 2.7.1 release that included new sidecar versions. I believe these sidecars are actually inherited from work in storage SIG. So when new versions are released, they get picked up by individual plugins potentially. The links to the actual full descriptions of those are in the agenda notes document. And moving on to the vSphere cloud provider, a version 1.26.1 was released just yesterday. It updated the version of Debian to fix a CVE. It fixed a CVE in Golang and updated a TLS cert for end-to-end test. There were also similar releases if you're on older versions of Kubernetes. A release 1.25.2 for Kubernetes 1.25, and similarly one for 1.24 went out yesterday. It was a Helm, if you install that by Helm chart, that was updated 4 days ago. On the vSphere front, there was an update to the vSphere 8 U1 docs just yesterday, and there were updated install binaries or patch binaries put out on April 18, once again for vSphere 8 update 1. There have been no recent updates to vSphere 7 update 3 in the past month. So that's kind of my recap of what's been going on the summary front. And I see in the chat, Vince, thanks for posting that update on the demise of Google Groups. Now, we had one person who just joined the group for the first time because he had a conflict. But I wanted to point out to people, and I discussed this last month with Bryson, that the Kubernetes Steering Committee has asked that this group be end of life. They originally had a plan that these user groups would be commissioned for all of the cloud providers, VMware vSphere being one of them, but other examples would be Amazon AWS running on Google's GCS or Microsoft's Azure. But as it turns out, nobody with these other vendors or other cloud providers ever put in place any structure to start one of these groups, so they never took place. And this has been the only group operating. It also being tied to the cloud provider has kind of left the impression that some things have been shut out. Nominally, this group isn't geared around the VMware distribution of Kubernetes. It could support any distribution of Kubernetes, whether it be Rancher, Red Hat OpenShift, or whatever, so long as it runs on the vSphere platform. But there is an interest in the Kubernetes and the CNCF to morph this group into something more like an on-prem user group, so that maybe we'd get more vigorous participation from people like Red Hat who might support on-prem Kubernetes. And as it turns out, a lot of the things involved with running on VMware might apply generically to any on-prem use of Kubernetes. Unlike a cloud provider where they would deliver you features like a load balancer, perhaps features related to ingress. When you do Kubernetes on top of VMware vSphere or bare metal on-prem, you're taking a lot of those collateral tools on yourself. And historically, when we've had group meetings, at least half the meetings have related to sidebar things that kind of are used in conjunction with Kubernetes on vSphere, but might also apply generically to running Kubernetes just in any on-prem environment, perhaps on a different hypervisor or no hypervisor at all. So we've kind of held discussions on opening up an on-prem user group under the CNCF rather than the Kubernetes project. And the reason they would prefer to have that under the CNCF rather than under the Kubernetes project, which is where this group is operating now, is that a lot of these collateral tools, like take load balancers, where you might have a load balancer such as KubeVim, those are already CNCF projects. So there's an anticipation that a lot of the discussions would in fact be related as much to non-Kubernetes projects as the Kubernetes project itself, so that operating under the CNCF might be preferable. Now, we've kind of been talking about it for a year, but have not gathered enough support to build a base of contributors to start this up. And the Kubernetes Steering Committee has asked that this group be twilighted with perhaps a last meeting next month in June, but it strikes me as very unlikely that by July we'd have an operating on-prem user group underneath the CNCF. Maybe we could aspire to getting that running in the fall, but starting up these kinds of things in the summer is kind of rough too, because having watched these groups, much of the world has heavy usage of vacation during the summer months, and attendance at anything from online Zoom meetings to physical conferences tends to drop pretty dramatically during the summer period. So I'm thinking that there might be a replacement group popping up sometime in the fall. But anyway, that's the summary that I wanted to point out to people so they're not shocked when should you see this group stop having meetings. That would be the explanation. I'm told we'll keep the Slack channel around, and the Google group does have a mailing list. So if some replacement group pops up under the CNCF, I would expect that I'd be able to send notices indicating to people where this now lives. So I'll give up the, I'll get off the soapbox and open it up for just group discussion. If anybody wants to bring anything up, whether it be questions, comments on anything I just said, or something out of the blue that just you'd like to talk about.
I just introduced myself a minute ago, but just to add to that, we run OpenShift at Vanderbilt, and the engineers that set up the environment have left the company, and we don't have too much deployed there, but the rest of us are kind of dipping our toes in the water and kind of learning the environment, and, getting a feel for what our service offerings should look like and how best to support it. So we do run everything on VMware, and OpenShift kind of has their own forums and things as well too, but it is nice to have other resources for on-prem, whether it's through VMware, whether it's through Docker. vMug might even be a good option if there's not already a vMug community set up under the community section of vMug for Kubernetes. That would probably be a potential place to pivot to.
Yeah, I think at least from what I've seen of vMug, it is more focused on dividing up by region, so that it tends to be as much as a social organization as a technical one. But where I live in California, they have physical meetings, and people go there to kind of even make friends, get contacts for future jobs, that kind of thing. And they focus more on regional divisions, covering everything under the sun at the meetings, rather than having topic specific, like Kubernetes specific factions. And
they have, they're mostly regional, at least on the vMug site, and oftentimes I don't even think to go back and visit these regularly, but there's like a community section under vMug at My Communities, and some of those are like there's one for home labs. There's like I don't see it now under my groups, but it seems like there used to be a healthcare related one, and so these, if nothing else, it's kind of a place to migrate user discussion, potentially, and kind of have support from vMug leadership as well. Just kind of something to throw out as a possibility.
I mean, I really think, my personal opinion is that if the Kubernetes Slack channel was used more, that would be a good central place for all this stuff. I've never used vMug, so I'm not sure on that, but
Well, I mean, Slack is great for, a chat room communication anyway.
Yeah, I would say the criticisms of Slack are within a specialized area, like take VMware. I think I have been somewhat policing it or trying to do the best I can, and you can get response, but you normally wouldn't expect to get it within an hour or something, um, at least in the VMware sector, because it kind of would work better, I think, if there was more activity. But if there aren't that many inquiries, what happens is the engineers don't look at it that often, and it results in high latencies. You've got other
Yep.
channels, though, like there's a generic one called Kubernetes users that has the opposite problem, where you've got users putting questions about everything under the sun to the point where you might get 20 messages in an hour sometimes at peak periods, and nobody can afford to pay attention to that. Or, I think most people have regular day jobs, and that job isn't policing a Slack channel. So even if you think you'll go in there and try to help some users out, you're maybe going to do that once a day or once a week, but then there's hundreds of messages in there and you're not going to dig back through them, or at least that's my own perception. So it results in a lot of inquiries in that Kubernetes user thing being more or less seems to get ignored because they kind of roll off beyond the history range where anybody who might answer them is willing to scroll back that far. So kind of not enough categorization, I think, is if you don't categorize, you can get a lot of volume. But if the topic is too general, you can't get anybody willing to sift through them for the things that they might care to comment on.
Yeah, I think discussion forums and chat rooms kind of meet different needs, for that reason, particularly if oftentimes when I'm having an issue, I'll go to a forum and, do a search to see if somebody's already posted the same topic and answered it. And it makes it easier to kind of archive things or look up keywords. And but forums aren't as good for just socializing and building community, getting to know people, or getting those immediate responses. So I think they both serve a place. And for the time being, your Google group is, serving the forum part of the need. But there's
I've got a recommendation for how you might make it work that I haven't heard this frequently recommended, but if I were in the shoes of a user, and of course I work for VMware, so it's a vendor, but I would go to one of these Slack channels and search for something in the same category that I have a question about or an inquiry about, and find the names involved. Now, it might not even be your exact question. It might be something that's a year old, but get the name. And I can tell you that at least if they're a VMware employee, you could then, put their @ in their handle in one of the channels and say, hey, I have this question about this. And I saw that you commented on something similar in the past. By any chance, would you be in a position to help me out and answer this question? And I think that, 3 out of 4 people would respond to that. And you're kind of just cherry picking and DMing, but
that's a
really,
good approach. Yeah.
If you put your name out there in public in a Slack, like the Kubernetes Slack, you're kind of signing up for that to be something that might happen. It's not like, and I think the odds are fairly high that people would pay attention, as opposed to, I don't know, there's some forums that are almost always going to be spam. Like I'm thinking LinkedIn, from my perspective, is something that if people try to ping me on LinkedIn, my general default is I'm likely to ignore it unless I, realize that I have some actual contact with the person.
Yeah, that's where I've got, that might have been how we got in contact initially. It was just like what you're doing, exactly what you're saying, finding the person that's working on whatever project or whatever thing you're working on and ping them, ask them for help. but find them even on the GitHub, right? And then go see if they're in Slack,
Yeah,
in the Kubernetes Slack.
I can tell you, as on the Kubernetes project, with regard to GitHub, there are so many notifications. Like you might touch a piece of code and then it sends you emails about a change to that code 3 years later. And I think most devs I know have their GitHub notifications at least muted, if not completely turned off, or going to some folder they never look at. Because the signal to noise ratio on GitHub tends
that's
to
why
be
I said
bad.
looking at it to find who it is and then try to find them on Kubernetes seems to be a more successful, on the Kubernetes side seems to be more successful. But a point I was going to make is, what, that actually is one of the benefits that we've had with this meeting, is being able to get, when people do have questions that may not be maybe a broader question, I guess. But when we've had questions about, say, hey, how's the CSI driver work for this? How's the migration? Different things. It was helpful to get in touch with the right people in a place that we could talk about it.
Right.
And I think that's been one of the benefits of this. I think one of the things about it, we've kind of matured from where we were when we started. I think there's been less questions about things.
Yeah, I think in the early days, you had a lot of first-time adopters, and that results in a different sort of question that is broader in nature and more applicable to everybody. And one of the things I think Kubernetes is reaching maturity level, kind of like Linux did 10 years ahead of it, to where it's dropping down below the waterline and people are even moving up into higher level stacks that run on top of Kubernetes, or tool chains that run on top of Kubernetes, so that the average IT person doesn't necessarily have to get into the internal plumbing understanding of Kubernetes that much anymore. It's also more stable and there's less feature churn going on.
Yeah, our biggest thing we have coming up would be switching over to the new CSI driver and cloud provider, which we aren't on because we started earlier, right? And so we had the in tree, so moving to the out of tree. And so I know we're going to have some questions that come up with that. I mentioned it even in the last meeting. So as we move on to that, so there's still questions, I think, out there to be had by, I'm sure there's others that are in a similar situation that maybe not part of this. But
then the other thing you can do with that technique, by the way, of DMing somebody on Slack, is even if they don't know, at least from my perspective, if somebody DMs me and asks, I'm willing to go find a person who does know, at least within VMware. I'll make an effort and try at least. And we've had people in who, within VMware, the topic is so broad that we've got storage specialists, cloud provider specialists, et cetera, and vSphere specialists. And you kind of need, if you need to go into a deep dive, you kind of need to get access to all of that.
Yeah, I think that's been the biggest benefit of this, these meetings, this group.
Just a heads up in terms, I just made the statement that, Kubernetes is slowing down, but one thing that might be of interest to people here that I think is a kind of dramatic shift that is actually, worthwhile too, is that the ingress mechanism within Kubernetes is on a path to being deprecated, and they've moved to something new called API Gateway. And the reason they moved is that there was a recognition that when they spec'd out ingress, they were a little too loose on the spec, so that people's actual experience with using ingress is that you could use something like Nginx or Contour, or, there must have been 10 different ingresses, and they all work differently enough that stuff wasn't actually portable, which is, the claim of being cloud native is that you could pick up your workloads, migrate them to a different platform that was Kubernetes compliant, and it should just work. But the fact is with Ingress, any implementation of Ingress tended to be different enough from any other one that if you moved from one to another, it didn't just work. And the API gateway is a mechanism that's kind of locking things down to a tighter degree. Under the covers, it quite likely has the same technology, but the interface to it is a little more standardized. And if you want something to kind of be looking at, you know, like all things in Kubernetes, they have a deprecation path that gives you a few years and doesn't force you to change overnight. But if you're using Ingress at all, I would say that API gateway is probably something you want to take a look at now and maybe make yourself a 1 or 2 year plan to, you know, look and see if it looks like you might get any benefit out of it. And if so, make a plan to do a migration. I see Vince has to move, but great chatting to you, Vince.
Hey, great chatting to you guys.
And, you know, the other thing I got back from KubeCon Europe, the other one that was interesting, if you use Service Mesh, was that it looks like the upcoming release of Istio has some very significant improvements. They're getting rid of the sidecars, and it appears, I have not used it myself yet, but it appears to be a quite significant re-architecture.
That's interesting.
And not without reason. I think, like many things, you know, you take your first pass at something, kind of learn from the limitations and mistakes, and maybe version 2 is significantly better. They do, by the way, I was talking to the people at the Istio booth. They were inviting me to help kind of document it or maybe give a future presentation on it, but it's anticipated that some of these features will indeed still work to do migrations of non-Kubernetes resources participating in a service mesh that's managed within Kubernetes. So by that, I mean, you can create a mesh in Kubernetes, but then join services or workloads that are not in Kubernetes. You know, maybe they're running on bare metal or they're running in VMs, but they can still join the service mesh. And you could do it in the old version too, but it was not well documented and not frequently used, but it looks like it might be fairly easy to pull off under this new version. I personally think that that has great attraction. I've sometimes been skeptical of efforts to run stateful services on Kubernetes as opposed to maybe hosting them in VMs. You know, take something like a stateful database server or something that has had decades of experience running it reliably, you know, in a on something like the VMware hypervisor, and it treats it in a different way. You know, the standard summary of Kubernetes versus VMware VMs, where you'd have things like high availability, are that when it runs under VM, the infrastructure is prepared to treat it as a pet, where you, if it gets unhealthy, you keep it alive, you nurse it back to life. And the Kubernetes philosophy is more like you run a bunch of them in parallel with horizontal load balancing. And if something gets sick, you just shoot it in the head and grow yourself another one. And it sounds good in theory. And there are some stateful services, I don't know, Cassandra, MongoDB, that from the get-go were architected for that kind of philosophy. But there are others that really grew up in an earlier era that maybe weren't architected with that Kubernetes-like philosophy. And if you could join them hosted in legacy technologies, but still take advantage of service mesh, that might be rather interesting and result in kind of more desirable behavior for certain organizations. You know, everybody is different. And I understand that there are those who believe that you want to move everything under Kubernetes, but I think there's room for other options, particularly when you're using some of these things in conjunction with legacy workloads that have not made the move to Kubernetes, but need to, where you need to share access with these kinds of tools with your Kubernetes workloads. Anyway, I think if that subject is of interest to you, there were some talks on that at KubeCon Europe. I don't think that they've posted those for public access yet. They kind of embargo them for a little while to encourage people to pay for tickets. But historically, the CNCF has published those within a month or two. I did notice that some of the so-called co-located events, the ones they had on the first day of KubeCon, those already have been published up on YouTube, and the videos seem to be all up there. It's up to the speaker as to whether they uploaded decks or not, but probably about half the decks are available.
Yeah, one of my colleagues just posted, I think there's a playlist that I don't know if it has all of them in there, but quite a few. So I have a question. This isn't specifically, I guess, Kubernetes, but could be like any of VMs on VMware. But we've seen some stuff with maybe the network or storage, or maybe the network causing vSAN to have some issues that would cause the VMs to go into a read-only file system state. And I mean, up to this point, we're monitoring for that and then rebooting the nodes. Sometimes they reboot fine and start to go read write again, and sometimes they need like an FSCK to get going again. And so then that right now is currently requiring manual intervention. I'm just curious in general, what's the best way to handle that situation?
Well, I think that if you're on vSAN, presumably that you've got full support. So if you do, I would just go through the actual support organization rather than try to go through the open source Kubernetes Slack to get to somebody. If you really wanted to go to the, and it isn't really a Kubernetes issue either. If it's vSAN itself going out and it affects VMs, whether they're running Kubernetes or not.
And I'm not even sure if it's not necessarily a VMware issue. Like it could be an underlying networking issue that's impacting vSAN. But when the storage is, not available for so long, then the OS says, hey, I'm going to mark this read only so I protect myself.
Yeah, in terms of correlating it, the best tool I've used for, once again, you'd have this is not open source and it's licensed technology, but the vRealize automation and kind of the observability tools that VMware has will look at all the logs at the different layers, all the way down from the hypervisor, the networking, the storage, and kind of correlate things to attempt to deduce a root cause. Not everybody has those though, but if you do, I think you get lucky over half the time in my experience, where this thing will clue you in by correlating things, error or warning messages in the log related to networking that came out in time periods very close to what anomalies that were happening up at the storage layer. I actually believe that if you ran something like the pure open source Elk Stack or something like that, that has those sorts of capabilities as well. And for all I know, I've never run them, but kind of alternate commercial observability stacks, Datadog and whatever, I I kind of believe they all have at least attempted to put tools like that in there that would try to have the tool help you out as opposed to having humans who know all these different levels. If for some reason, pursuing support isn't working for you, there are the people on Kubernetes Slack who are into storage, like Xing Zhang, who I think has talked to this group before. And if you look at the people who've responded to inquiries about the CSI plugin, you could ping one of them just to inquire. They aren't likely to have the networking knowledge, but they maybe could peer up or find somebody who does. When you do this, I mean, I think the recommendation has always been that you dedicate some storage bandwidth to the storage as opposed to your workloads too. Not everybody does that, but I think that is the suggestion in the docs. And if you're using virtualized networking, through the VMware platform, there are ways where you can dedicate bandwidth, although in a lot of on-prem data centers, they actually even dedicate physical infrastructure to the storage network, so they'll have multiple NICs inside each server. And some of these are really only serving the storage backplane or maybe storage plus control plane. And the actual VM workloads are on their own independent dedicated NICs. So it's sort of an approach like firewalling where misconfigurations or bad code on the application side can't take out your infrastructure, at least in theory.
Well, but if it's it depends on what type of storage, right? If it's the storage of the VM, it still takes out the VM.
Yeah.
Right. If it's the root file system, then.
Yeah. So, generically, all I could suggest is, going down into the logs, looking for warnings and errors related to networking and seeing if any of those are occurring at the same time you're seeing these storage issues. Maybe even not only looking for errors and warnings, but maybe looking at utilization graphs and seeing if maybe these anomalies correspond to things going up to 100%. Because most of these things, if you get a lot of network retries and things, that pretty much always is going to end up in a log somewhere. Same thing with connection dropouts.
Yeah, I mean, it is network things, but again, this is for us, it's on like an edge. So it's not like in a data center where you have as highly reliable.
Okay, so you don't have a lot of redundancy is what you're saying. And
I mean, there's some redundancy there, but we have smaller clusters. There's yeah, so I mean, we know that there's going to be some of that impact at the infrastructure level. So the question, I guess my question really is not getting back to rooting that out, but the best way to handle when those file systems go into read-only are. So we put in like a monitor and memory that will see, hey, I went read-only. It's been read-only too long, so we're going to reboot the node, and that'll come back up, and we'll save quite a bit at the time. But you may get multiple VMs on the same cluster that come up fine, and then one that doesn't and says it needs needs the file system checked. Anyways, trying to just see if there's a better way to handle that. I know I had looked at some VMware documentation that said you can do something and not mark it read only, but then it leaves you open to more actual file system.
Actual corruption or something.
Corruption. doing that. So
yeah, while I'm talking to you, I was doing a Google search, seeing if there's anything like that, but I'm not sure. I'm Miles Gray, who hasn't been that active here lately, would be the storage expert. You could try to ping Miles on the on Slack just to see if you get a response.
So, all right. Well, I don't need to. We don't need to.
Yeah, I don't think we can fix it in this call.
No,
and
I just put it out there in case there was something like that. You were like, oh yeah, this is something I've heard of before.
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry. And you know, anything else? We've got 15 minutes left. If anybody else wants to bring anything up. Todd, I see you're still on, but I haven't heard from you.
Yeah, just listening.
Okay. And either of you, if we do go through with this idea of getting an on-prem user group, you know, the CNCF would like to have some users sign up to be kind of management of the group, if you will, or at least sponsors, because I think they're always cautious about having them turn into kind of promotional vendor pitch forums. And I think that that's a good philosophy. So if either of you are interested in being one of those user sponsors, should we be able to form a group, an on-prem user group under the CNCF, let me know, because I can, I should be able to get you listed in that role. There might be some benefits of that role. If you ever go to KubeCon, they'll at least recognize you, or, you know, maybe there might be circumstances where you could even get a free pass or something if you give a talk.
I'm interested. I'm the VMUG leader for my city also.
Okay. What city are you in?
Omaha, Nebraska.
Okay. Uh-huh. And if nobody's got anything else they want to talk about, I think maybe I'll end this meeting a little bit early. You know, we don't need to sit here recording dead air, but I'm open to anything people have come across that's interesting. Okay,
No,
well,
I'm good right now.
With that said, I plan to hold another meeting first Thursday in June. Thanks for coming, and we'll see you then. Bye.
Okay, thanks.
Bye.